Sometimes I wonder, what if I didn't just wake up alone in a room, but in a world? Not in a quiet apartment, but in a universe emptied of breath, voice, and witness. The first thing I noticed wasn't fear, it was silence. So complete, so deep, it felt like it was listening. A pale thread of sunlight slid through the blinds and stretched across the wooden floor like a slow-moving compass, searching for something or someone no longer there. I stepped barefoot outside, onto warm asphalt still holding the breath of dawn. No footsteps, no car horns, no murmurs through windows or barking dogs echoing from distant courtyards. The city had forgotten its own name. I walked down the street, and every reflection was only me. Shop windows, car mirrors, glass doors, each one offered my face back to me like a question I couldn't answer. And suddenly, I felt like a ghost staring into a museum diorama of what life used to be. The parked cars had their doors ajar, half-finished coffee cups steamed slightly beside open laptops. Wind moved through empty bus stops, lifting old newspapers into slow, weightless dances. Nothing was broken, no smoke, no chaos, no bodies, just disappearance, clean and absolute, as if humanity had blinked out of existence between heartbeats. I tried the radio, static, the phone, dead, no messages, no warnings, no news, not even a goodbye. I wasn't surviving an apocalypse, I was existing in its absence. The world hadn't ended, it had paused. And I was left alone inside the punctuation mark. Everything was intact, but hollow. The silence wasn't passive, it pressed against my skin like low-pressure air before a storm. My fingertips tingled. My breath fogged the glass of an abandoned subway car. Even time felt slowed, thickened, like honey tipping in slow motion from a jar, and I was suspended in it, unsure whether I was falling or floating. Inside a grocery store, the automatic doors still opened with a cheerful beep. Lights flickered above pristine aisles. I passed through a kingdom of abundance, untouched by need. And then, I smelled something. Ripe, overripe. A banana softening into collapse. The sweetness was sharp, fermented, full of endings. That scent anchored reality more than any silence had. Civilization wasn't dead. It was still decaying. I picked up a mango and bit into it. It was warm, sticky, radiant with sugar and sun. Too alive for a world so empty. And in that moment, it was clear. This wasn't a dream. This was mine to live through, or mine to unravel. I wasn't the last human. I was the first in a world that had decided to move on. At first, it felt like freedom. Like the childhood fantasy of breaking into a toy store after hours, except now the store was the world. I could go anywhere, touch anything, wear whatever I wanted, drive whatever I could find. There were no lines, no locks, no eyes watching from across the street. I walked into a luxury penthouse, slid across its marble floors, turned on every light just because I could. Then I climbed onto the roof, dressed in a fur coat I'd never buy in the old world, and watched the city blink beneath me like an abandoned motherboard. Somewhere inside, I laughed. Not from joy, more from disbelief. I was the ruler of a kingdom with no witnesses. I drove a red sports car through the center of the city, past blinking stoplights that still believed in rules. My reflection chased me in glass windows and metal railings, always alone, always multiplying. I turned up the music as loud as it would go, classical, then hip-hop, then nothing but static, and screamed into the wind like it could answer back. I ate cake with my hands inside a 5-star hotel lobby. I swam in an aquarium tank, surrounded by slow, blinking fish that didn't know the world had changed. And all the while, the silence stayed. Watching, waiting, patient. The sun set slowly that day, as if unsure whether it should bother. Without traffic, the shadows fell uninterrupted, stretching endlessly across the motionless streets. I climbed onto a cinema roof, projected a film onto the side of a nearby building, and watched it from a folding chair with a bottle of champagne. The images danced on concrete, ghosts of people, stories written for crowds that no longer existed. There was something holy about it, and something grotesque. I cheered at the ending. No one clapped with me. By the third day, I started naming the pigeons. They looked at me with that sideways city stare, unimpressed, unconcerned. I found a mannequin in a department store and dressed it in a suit, sat it across from me at a table, poured it coffee. The silence was louder now. It had corners, echoes, personalities. I found myself talking aloud, narrating my movements like I was on camera. The world was still full of things, but without anyone else, they had no weight. Ownership lost its meaning. Who was I stealing from? Who was I proving anything to? Then I walked into the Natural History Museum. The lights were dim, the air still. I stood beneath the skeleton of a whale, its bones suspended like a question across centuries. I could hear the creak of the cables in the ceiling. I touched the ribcage with my fingertips. The cold of the fossil vibrated faintly into my skin, like a tuning fork. This creature had once crossed oceans, and now it was displayed in silence, like everything else. Was that my future too? Movement turned into memory, flesh into artifact. I left the museum with sand in my shoes. Outside, the wind had shifted. A plastic bag danced in the air like a specter. I suddenly felt the weight of every unused object on Earth, every unopened letter, every half-written story, all of it still here, still waiting. But for what? It began quietly, not with an explosion or a siren, but with the steady flicker of lights in the dead of night. At first, I didn't notice. The city still hummed faintly as if clinging to its habits, but slowly it began to slip. Street lamps that failed to blink on, elevators stalled between floors, the low electric breath of refrigerators falling silent. Without people to reset, refuel, repair, the veins of civilization began to clot. Power grids darkened, cell towers blinked out, the great invisible net that once bound us together snapped strand by strand. The world was still here, but it was falling asleep. I stood in front of a gas station, pump in hand, trying to make it work. The screen blinked nonsense. I walked inside, past racks of chips and half-melted candy, into the back room where I could hear the soft ticking of something dying. I found manuals, read until dawn. Even as I taught myself, I could feel the decay settling in. Fuel, once so effortless, was now a puzzle. Planes rusted on runways, cars were becoming coffins for yesterday's movement. I stopped traveling. The world was open, but I was trapped in its silence. Food was next. Perishables turned soft, bloomed with white fur. I scavenged what I could, became an expert in expiration dates, color changes, the sound of pressure when you open a can. I rationed. I learned to build traps for squirrels, to clean a fish without gagging, to boil water twice just in case. Supermarkets turned into tombs of abundance, bright aisles filled with calories no one could claim. I moved like a monk through their silence, collecting without joy. And then came the rot. Not just in food or buildings, but in the very skin of the city. Without maintenance, structures began to breathe and bend. Moisture crept into foundations. Trees broke through sidewalks. Mold grew like a second atmosphere inside sealed rooms. In one apartment, I found mushrooms growing on a piano. I played a single note, and the spores danced in the sunlight like dust remembering the shape of music. Everything was unraveling, but softly, with the grace of neglect. I tried to stay ahead of it. I found a cabin outside the city, stocked it, reinforced it. Still, the air felt heavier each day. And then I remembered, there are more than 400 nuclear power plants in the world. All automated, all alone. Their safety systems ticking, blinking, decaying. I stood on a hill one morning, watching the horizon for something. Smoke, collapse, the sky blooming in unnatural color. Nothing came. But knowing was enough. Some places I would never return to. I drew imaginary borders in my mind, marking off the map like wounds too deep to clean. One night, lightning struck the edge of the forest. I saw the flame crawl through the trees like a thought. There were no sirens, no one to fight it. I ran. I remember the heat on my back, the smoke catching in my throat, the sound of branches screaming. Civilization had left behind its bones and its dangers, and now they were mine to navigate. Alone. In the absence of others, my body became the only thing I truly possessed. Every breath, every bruise, every twinge of pain was no longer a passing inconvenience. It was a warning. Without doctors, without hospitals, without even the idea of help, injury became an existential threat. A sprained ankle could mean the end, a toothache, a slow descent into madness. I became intimate with my own biology. I listened to the rhythm of my pulse, learned the terrain of my skin, counted every heartbeat like a ticking clock I could not afford to ignore. I built a first aid arsenal from abandoned pharmacies. Shelves once stocked for communities now served one. I moved through antiseptic-scented aisles with a reverence I hadn't expected. I gathered bandages, antibiotics, antiseptics, syringes. I taught myself to suture with shaking hands, practiced on scraps of leather. I memorized symptoms of infections, stages of hypothermia, the color codes of warning signs. And still, I lived in fear of a misstep, a rusty nail, a bad can of food. Each action had to be deliberate, each motion calculated to avoid disaster. Water became sacred. At first, I had bottles, dozens of them, stacked in basements and closets. But one by one, they emptied. I learned to purify stream water with charcoal, sand, and fire. I boiled, filtered, rationed. In the mornings, I'd watch the condensation collect on leaves and slide into jars, each drop a silent triumph. The sound of boiling water became a lullaby, the smell of clean steam, a kind of hope. I learned the weight of dehydration, the dryness of the mouth, the fatigue in the limbs, the pressure behind the eyes. And I respected it. Then came the cold. Blankets weren't enough. I sealed windows, layered clothes, built fires from furniture. The nights grew longer. I began to fear sleep. Not for nightmares, but for not waking. I wrapped my hands in old scarves, lit candles, listened to the crackle of wood. Even in warmth, the air felt foreign, like it no longer wanted me. I looked at my body in the mirror. Thinner, paler, more animal. I saw the shape of hunger carved beneath my ribs, the curve of solitude in my shoulders. I wasn't dying, but I wasn't fully alive either. And through it all, a question whispered behind my ribs, what am I surviving for? I had built shelter, secured water, preserved food. I had dodged infection, fire, and the collapse of concrete. But what did any of it mean if there was no one left to speak my name? I sat one evening with my hands around a tin cup of soup, listening to the wind scrape across the roof. My skin smelled of smoke and salt. My nails were chipped. I was warm. I was fed. I was no longer human in the way I had known. The world had stripped away every convenience, every safety net, every layer of abstraction. And what was left beneath? A beating heart. Calloused palms, eyes searching the horizon not for danger, but for witness. Without others, survival wasn't noble. It was mechanical. It was lonely, and it was beginning to feel hollow. There came a day when the silence began to speak, not with words, not with voices, but through the slow drip of time on the walls of my mind. I stopped talking aloud, not because there was no one to hear me, but because even my own voice felt foreign, like it belonged to someone who had vanished along with the rest of the world. So I listened. I listened to the creak of the floorboards beneath my steps, the rhythm of rain against the tin roof, the distant groan of rusting metal as buildings sighed into disrepair. These sounds became companions, faint echoes of a world that once hummed with life. I started writing, not letters, not journal entries, just fragments, words on walls, notes carved into the bark of trees, sentences on napkins and pages torn from books. I wasn't preserving knowledge. I was leaving breadcrumbs for no one, a kind of desperate archaeology in reverse, documenting a presence no one would ever discover. I began to imagine myself from the outside, a figure wandering the remains of civilization, building altars of memory from plastic bags and burned-out flashlights. I laughed at myself sometimes. The sound always died too quickly. Eventually, I found a dog, or maybe it found me. It stood in the doorway one morning, wet from the storm, eyes sharp but unsure. We stared at each other like two survivors of a shipwreck, meeting on opposite ends of a beach. I let it come inside, fed it, named it, talked to it. It didn't speak back, of course, but it listened. Or maybe I just needed to believe it did. In the evenings, it would curl at my feet as I read books aloud into the flickering firelight. Stories about people, families, lovers, friends. I read not to remember the world, but to remind myself what I was missing. I passed an old school once and went inside. Dust coated everything. Desks, chalkboards, the cracked tiles of the hallway. I walked into a classroom, sat down in a child's chair, and imagined the sound of laughter, the shuffling of papers, the echo of a question asked aloud. I tried to remember the last time someone had looked at me. Really looked. Not through a screen, not in passing, but with the full weight of shared existence. The absence of others wasn't just a physical void, it was a collapse of perspective. I had become the only mirror in a house of dust. I thought about freeing the animals in the zoo, about building a community of creatures, lions, parrots, elephants. The fantasy fell apart quickly. Not all of them would want to be friends, not all of them would understand. In the end, I returned to the dog. He was enough. And yet, at night, as I lay in a bed that once belonged to someone else, I'd catch myself whispering names I barely remembered. Names of people I had loved, people I had wronged, people I'd never had the chance to say goodbye to. Their ghosts lived inside the empty spaces between my sentences. And sometimes when the wind hit the windows just right, it sounded like footsteps. One morning I woke before the sun. The sky was a dark, bruised blue, and the air held that fleeting silence just before dawn takes its first breath. I stood at the edge of a cliff, overlooking what was once a city. The buildings below were half swallowed by vines and shadow, soft outlines in a world learning how to forget. I watched as the first light poured over them, golden and slow, illuminating rust, shattered windows, and rooftop gardens gone wild. It looked beautiful, like the earth was healing from something it had long endured, maybe from us. I closed my eyes and listened, not for voices, not anymore, but for meaning, for the echo of something deeper, older than language. I remembered how stars are not truly where we see them. Their light takes years, sometimes millennia, to reach us. The night sky is a tapestry of ghosts. And I began to wonder, if someone someday looked back at Earth from a far-off planet, what light would they see? Would they read the signals we left behind? The satellites still orbiting, the golden record drifting through space, the ruins, the books, the bones. Would they know we laughed? That we loved? That we tried? In the quiet that followed, I began to notice the smallest things. The pattern of lichen on stone, the hum of bees inside the walls, the way dust floats in a beam of sunlight, each particle a drifting story. Without the noise of civilization, these things became vast, sacred. The dog sat beside me, breathing slow and steady, like a metronome to the rhythm of my solitude. I reached out, ran my fingers through his fur, and felt more connected in that moment than I had in years. I no longer feared death. Not because I had conquered it, but because I had made peace with its twin, absence. What terrified me now was something else entirely. That we might have never been real without each other. That existence is not a solitary act, but a chorus. And I was singing alone in the aftermath, hoping that somewhere, somehow, an echo might return, not to save me, but to prove I had been here. That's when I began to build. Not a monument, not a message, just something. A garden. A trail of painted stones. A wind chime made of broken glass and bent spoons. Something humble and strange and unmistakably human. I didn't need to be remembered. I needed to leave behind something that could be. A shape in the dirt. A rhythm in the air. A question carved into the skin of the earth. Something to say. I existed, even if no one was watching. And maybe that's all we ever really do. Maybe our purpose was never to conquer or to last, but to leave traces. Smudges of thought, fragments of beauty, footprints in a forest that no one else will walk. I sat beside the chime as the wind picked up and the shards began to sing, soft and uneven. It wasn't music, but it was enough. So now I wonder, if everything we are only exists in the eyes of another, then what are we when the eyes are gone? What if the last thing we ever leave behind is the question? What if you were never really alone?